I'm going to share the Makorot. Okay. I'm going to start with this piece from Luchot of Shivrei Luchot, sort of one of the big books of Rav Shagar's essays on various topics. A lot of them have to do with postmodernism. This is from an essay called Religious Zionism in a Postmodern World. Just talking a lot about being religious Zionist in a Israeli context, so sort of modern Orthodox in a modern world, in today's world, and what that means. And part of what he deals with there is the question of, he's talking about a student who came to him talking about the problem how, according to sort of the strictest layer of halacha from the Gemara, you're not allowed to save a non-Jew's life on Shabbat. That the limud that allows the drasha from the Torah that allows for saving a life on Shabbat, to break halacha in order to save a life on Shabbat, doesn't apply to non-Jews. There's two drushes about this in the Gemara. One is you're better to break one Shabbat and save, and then keep observing lots of Shabbatot afterwards. That only applies to saving a Jew, because only Jews going to save those, keep those Shabbatot. And another is the mitzvah says v'chai b'hem, but the non-Jew is not going to live in the mitzvot. So the halacha you're not supposed to save a non-Jew, and there are technical resolutions to that in halacha. You find to say that mishum eva, because if we don't save non-Jews' lives, then the rest of the non-Jews will kill us. And Rav Shagar, that's not really satisfying. But this is not satisfying because we want it on an ethical level. We want that to be true, that we can save non-Jews' lives. We don't want it to be just a matter of on a technical level. We can sort of get out of this on a technicality. No, we really want to be able to save non-Jews' lives on like an ethical level. But then, so he moves on from that discussion to saying, well, what does it even mean to ask this question, right? When we say that we think ethically we are supposed to do something outside of halacha, that means we either think God is unethical, or we think God really wants us to break halacha. In this case, God is ethical, and that's where he comes to this sort of discussion about what about people who never ask that question? What about people who never ask if maybe ethics or God might require something outside of halacha? I asked him, who truly fears heaven, right? Me yirei shamayim be'emet. Is it not the person who asks what is God's will, who asks himself, if it's really God's will that he leave the Arab to die? Do I not need to ask this question and answer with total sincerity? Some people obey without hesitation. I love this line. That totally self-confident, never once standing before God and asking themselves with respect and sincerity, directly and without intermediary, what is God's will? Do these people really fear heaven? And I concluded, as Rav Shagar saying, he concluded, I'm unsure. Perhaps they really don't doubt what God's will is, or perhaps they don't actually have faith he wants something. Rav Shagar is saying that when we don't ever ask the question, what does God want? Could it possibly be that God doesn't want us to save the non-Jew? That God somehow wants us to only, on a technicality, save the non-Jew? On some level, you might have asked that question and answer with total confidence. You know what? Halacha absolutely reflects God's will, no question. But many people who are so totally confident that halacha reflects God's will have really stopped thinking about the question of what God wants from them. That the question of what God wants from them is a question they've never had to ask, because the answer has always been there before them. The answer's always been halacha, right? And they've never had to wonder, what does God want? And therefore, they've never been concerned by that question. So what Shagar is suggesting is that level of doubt, at the very least, being open to the possibility that even you might say, oh, I'm never going to break halacha actually, but you have to wonder if there's some sort of, is this always what God wants? Otherwise, on some level, you stop thinking about God. You are able to keep halacha without ever wondering if God is involved. It's able to be something totally separate from God. And then he brings a quote from the Me'ashilach, which I've skipped out here. And then he says, what had I done? Had I taken that boy who asked me about saving on Jewish Shabbat and thrown him into a world of uncertainty, chronic doubt, and undecided misgivings? I'd actually hoped I'd opened him up for the possibility of faith and a real contact with the divine. I quoted from the statement of a Hasidic Rebbe, the Me'ashilach, who said, the righteous man, the tzaddik, who consciously inserts himself into doubts, is greater than one who avoids them. As for the Me'ashilach, as long as we sort of live on the level of fixed rules and principles and never ask if those fixed rules and principles match up with God, we are almost certainly going to miss God and never going to encounter God. Yeah, Charlie.
One of the things that I've heard a lot this year, I don't know, I doubt this is Orayta specific, probably just in the yeshiva world, is in certain philosophical questions, shirim, we talk about, and try to confront issues, but we'll also say, like, let's not create questions for those people who don't have them. I'm wondering to what degree would Rav Shagar endorse, I guess, generating questions for people without them on a grander scale. I understand a student comes up to him and he says, "What had I done?" Sort of questioning maybe whether or not his answer was, I guess, pragmatic and the sort of long-term effect on the student. I'm wondering to what degree, when he was working or teaching in yeshivas, was he creating questions for sort of like more pasha yids?
It's a good question. And there's not a simple answer. One, because within Rav Shagar's his own writings, he has sort of multiple ideas. Like this text would seem to say absolutely yes, right? This text would seem to suggest that that there's value to questions. A lot of other texts emphasize what in Hebrew called baitiyut, the sense of like being at home, and not being alienated at all from halacha. And this absolutely creates, at least even if you're going to keep, keeping halacha absolutely, this does create some degree of alienation from halacha. Moreover, I have a friend named Rabbi Arizev Schwartz. You guys have maybe seen around the base. I know I've seen a couple copies of The Spiritual Revolution of Rav Kook. It's a collection of translated pieces from Rav Kook. He's the translator, but he's also been going around collecting stories from Rav Shagar's students about Rav Shagar. And he really sort of sometimes, it seems like, absolutely sort of wanted to challenge his students and give them, real questions, because he thought they were important for stuff like this. And sometimes he really didn't. It's a phenomenal drasha in the Book of Hanukkah drashot from Rav Shagar, about Rabbi Nachman's story of the guest, which is a story about this guest who comes and sort of totally takes the person who was, staying in their own home, takes him out of his own home, out of his life, takes him to this sort of spiritual world. And it's simultaneously like a mystical experience, but also a very threatening experience. And Rav Shagar says there, a teacher's teaching is always like that. When you're a teacher, your world is in some ways at the very least very different from the students, and you're going to start like teaching them the things you're interested in. Like on some level, I put together this source sheet because this is the questions I was asking and I was wondering about, and thinking about, and the text interested me. So I've in some level going to impose that upon you guys, and that's the teacher always do that on their students, and it can be discomforting and off-putting sometimes, at the very least. Simcha.
This may be a question just on the opinion in general, but how can you say that a system that is inherently variable can reflect a consistent will?
What do you mean?
Meaning, let me give an example. Something that's like bothered me previously is like the halachot of ribis. So like, there's probably you couldn't get more pshat like in the Torah that you're not allowed to charge interest. Yet we've created a halachic loophole in which we now have the ability to charge interest, quote unquote, halachically. I don't understand how one could argue that reflects the will of God.
I think there's two options. One is, and then that's a little off topic stuff that we'll get back into Rav Shagar. Or something I'll try and tie it in. One is you sort of take the will back a level, right? God's will isn't the direct pratim of the mitzvot in the Torah. God's will is that we follow the Torah as interpreted and applied and managed by Chazal, right? So that means the details of the way that ends up working out might be like more directly shaped by Chazal, but that's endorsed by God. Another option might be, and this is more the direction which Rav Shagar wants to go, and it does complicate things, is the prophecy model of sort of ongoing change, where God's will can be constantly present with new parts of the system, even though they could absolutely contradict the old parts of it. Like, right, you're 100%, the issue of rebeat is one of the places, if I'm not mistaken, where Chazal raised the question. The phrase "Oker davar min haTorah." Chazal have uprooted something from the Torah. Another place where that comes up is Pruzbul, which is the idea that though all of the debts are given up at Shemitah, unless you write a Pruzbul which says that the debts keep going, basically because the law, according to at least the Bavli, the Orayta law wasn't working anymore. The law had been meant to ensure people got loans. It was actually doing the opposite, ensuring people didn't get loans. So the Pruzbul was made to change that. But I'll say, okay, so Hillel has just gone and uprooted part of the Torah. And like, how does that work? And they have different answers in Yerushalmi, the Bavli, various Rishonim. It's a different sugya. But you're right. It's a problem, and you have to either make God's will slightly less direct, slightly more removed from the individual details of halacha, or you have to say that God's will is like almost infinitely varied. It includes all kinds of different possibilities within it, and at that point, no longer looks like what we think of as will. It's something distinctly divine. Any questions on that Rav Shagar piece? Okay, so I'm gonna look at a piece we saw briefly at the end of last week, where he's again pointing this tension and talking about sort of what it feels like to be really asking these questions, to be asking, what if God wants something different from me in this situation? What if God wants me to, save this person's life? We're gonna just it's even a question, I think, of also how you keep halacha and to what degree you identify God absolutely with halacha, or say God is somehow almost greater than halacha. I don't know who I've mentioned before, Rav Menachem Froman, but he has a phenomenal piece talking with the Meshilach, and he talks about how, and Rav Shagar talks as well, the Ishbitzer, the Meshilach, was famous for talking about how God might want you to break halacha. But as opposed to the various groups of Hasidim who were known for breaking halacha, the Ishbitzer Hasidim were actually not known for that. They were known for being pretty strict about halacha. So why do you have this one? Yeah. You guys lost me?
30 seconds?
Yeah, right when you said
that. You said Ishbitzer.
Yeah, so the Ishbitzer is known for saying that you should break halacha sometimes, that God wants you to break halacha, or could want a person to break halacha. But also Ishbitzer Hasidim were not known for breaking halacha, as opposed to like other forms of Hasidim who were attacked for davening after Zman, or even lighting candles on Shabbat and stuff. Like the Hasidim were attacked for breaking halacha, and it seems like the Ishbitzer Hasidim didn't, despite the fact that the Ishbitzer is the most famous teacher for teaching that sometimes God wants you to break halacha. And so Rav Menachem Froman's answer is that he wants you to have a different relationship with halacha. He wants you to have exactly this relationship where you recognize that halacha is a system that was given to Bnei Israel, but as a system, it can't ever be all-inclusive of the divine. That God will always transcend any system, and therefore you have to observe halacha as sort of something valuable for God, but not the be-all and end-all. Uri, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I was gonna say the idea in general that you spoke about 2 weeks ago, the Nasa Benishma being part of Muhammad Har Sinai, not accepting it. Also, just the general idea of this Jewish collective unconscious that kind of validates Chazal, and Chazal's different ways of darshaning the Torah, but one of the main factors being that there's this collective Jewish unconscious. Do you think that outside of that framework we can relate to that on an individual level as we look at the times that we might see fitting to break halacha, being able to say that almost the mazal of the Jewish people, but almost that ethic expressed through me that I'm tapped into, I'd be able to say that, because I feel you're wandering into this is definitely wandering into very uncertain territory here.
Yeah, it is very uncertain. I think there's a variety of ways of trying to deal with this. I was just looking today, actually, at the Rambam in Shmona Prakim, at the end of the 5th parak of Shmona Prakim, which is his introduction to Pirkei Avot. And he talks about exactly this idea. He raises the idea from Chazal of Bechol darchecha de'ehu. It's a line from Mishlei. Know God in all your ways. And they say even l'davar avera, even for something that's an avera. Rama seems to say, yeah, even for an avera, you should break halacha when you know that it's the right thing to do. And if he's basing it on a slightly different question, which is that, for Rambam, the Torah has goals, the Torah has clear goals of the Tanai mitzvot, but they might not work all the time. The mitzvot, the ways in which the Torah is trying to enact those goals might not be best suited for achieving those goals in all times with all people, because that's just the nature of things for Rambam, is that any rule made for the general, like the majority of cases, in the majority of times, the majority of people, like most people, most of the time it'll work for, but sometimes it won't work for everyone. Sometimes it might work for almost no one. And those times Rambam says you need horat sha'ah, like you need the Navi or Beit Din to create some sort of temporary ruling, or you need the individual to step outside it. And for Rambam, he's much more in the direction you're talking about. You're talking about collective unconscious in some way. For Rambam, it's like, no, you understand what the Torah is aiming at, and that it needs to be broken in a situation. There's some level of, again, Rambam is able to separate the details of halacha from sort of like the Torah's goals. Sort of the same thing Rav Shagar wants to do with God's will. Akiva.
Where's that riff from, please?
It's in Chasidim Tochakim Mizeh. It's around, there's a couple pieces around like 179, 180. I can send them to you guys. The Hebrew and the English. Yeah, Charlie.
Just going back a couple minutes, any idea when the piece by, was it Ari Schwartz?
Yeah.
Is going to be published?
Nah, we were supposed to publish a book last year that was like half us talking about Rav Shagar and half his stories, and now it's going to be like he's making a whole book of stories. I got no idea when it's going to happen, and he's getting married next week, so like it could be pushed off for a while. Yeah.
You're not excited he's getting married?
Okay, it's actually now 7:15. So if we don't have any other questions, I'll see you guys later. See you next week. Okay, great.
Thanks, Rav.
Thank you guys. Nice to see you.